Thanks very much, Bethan. Just while I'm giving the talk, what I thought I'd do is just play in the background a documentary made at the time about the events in 1968. Because I think that often, and it's a lot of just very raw footage of the events in France in 1968. Because, and I suppose I wanted to play that because I think a lot of us, I know I'm just barely old enough to have been alive when that happened. I was about 3 years old in 1968. But a lot of us, I think, haven't seen that. The presentation that we usually get of 1968, and especially what happened in France, is often a very, very narrow view of students, students just behaving idealistically and, and so on. I mean, Gucci had an ad campaign this year. I don't know if anybody saw it, but this really expensive ad campaign, which is all about 1968. I see some people with T-shirts here saying "La beauté est dans la rue," which is one of the slogans of France in 1968. This was Gucci dans la rue, and it was all students, prancing around universities and streets and so on, not doing anything in particular, but trying to advertise their very expensive clothes. And I think that what I want to sort of give a glimpse of in the documentary, and what I want to try and cover in the talk, is really the significance of May 1968 in France. One writer described May 1968 in France as the epicenter of an earthquake that reverberated across time and geography. France in 1968 happened in a year of really momentous events, starting with the Tet Offensive against the US war in Vietnam, in which the Vietnamese resistance forces inflicted a very humiliating blow against American imperialism and really encouraged the rise of an anti-war movement internationally. But 1968 also, in 1968, saw the assassination of Martin Luther King and the explosion of resistance in cities across the US. Elsewhere in Europe, there were massive demonstrations, for example, by students in Germany and so on. So in fact, some of the revolutionary students who played a key role in the events in Paris in 1968 had actually been on demonstrations, anti-Vietnam War demonstrations in Berlin, not long before, in sort of February and March of 1968. The leader of the Berlin of the radical students in Germany, Rudi Dutschke, was shot in an attempted assassination and so on. So you get a sense of the tension that existed at that time, and this was followed by mass student fighting in Germany in April. Later on that year, you had what was known as the Prague Spring, the massive democracy movement that emerged and working class movement that emerged in Czechoslovakia in June. In May of June of that year, and all of those, which is eventually crushed by Russian tanks, and really that and a whole series of other things that happened, to the riots and the repression of students protesting against the war at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago later on that year, and even things like my hometown, Derry, sort of the explosion of the civil rights movement. Resisting the repression by the police in mass rioting and all that sort of stuff are all connected, and we can't see France in May 1968 simply as isolated from all those events, but really as something that really encouraged and really accelerated a process that was to unfold over the next 4, 5, 6 years right across Europe and internationally, in which the working class movements, and alongside the movements of the oppressed, women, blacks, lesbian and gay people, and so on, began to fight for their rights in a massive series of movements. And that's really and the significance, I think, of France in 1968 is really that not just that it was a part of all those events and something that spurred those events internationally, but also that it returned the question of the working class as being the agent of social change back to the centre of politics, or at least opened up the possibility of that being a realistic prospect. And I think the place to start with France in 1968 is to say that what happened in May appeared seemingly without warning. It appeared seemingly from nowhere. The French, French national television, which was very tightly controlled by the state in France, in early 1968, covered the student movement in Italy and Germany and so on, but in order to make the point, and in order to contrast what was going on in the rest of Europe with how placid and respectable and peaceful French students were. So this is the point that they were trying to make, that France was a harmonious country and so on, not bedeviled by these clashes that were to be seen elsewhere. The level, excuse me, the level of working class struggle was very, very low. A French Marxist, André Gortz, wrote early on in that year, wrote an essay in the Socialist Register, and he said, "In the foreseeable future, there will be no crisis of European capitalism so dramatic as to drive the mass of workers to revolutionary general strikes." Gortz's argument was, and it was quite a popular and very persuasive argument, even among the left in Europe at the time, was that workers had been bought off by the consumer society, that owning refrigerators, owning cars and so on, be able to go on holidays and so on, had somehow bought off the working class. The German philosopher Herbert Marcuse, who became quite influential among some of the radical students involved in the movement, wrote at the time, "In the advanced industrial countries where the transition to socialism was supposed to take place, and precisely in those countries, the most advanced capitalist countries, the labouring classes are in no sense a revolutionary potential." And it was very common to refer to the age as an age of apathy, of social peace, and so on. And what I want to do in the talk is try to explain how and why it is that we see this incredible, momentous series of events appear suddenly out of nowhere, where demonstrations by often small numbers of students lead to mass demonstrations in the centre of Paris, which are repressed by the police, in which the students fight back, riot, night of the barricades on the 10th of May, and so on, which thousands join in and repel the police. That leads to a general strike called by the unions on the following Monday, the 13th of March, and which then ushers in a wave of factory occupations and strikes right across France. 10 million workers on strike in the space of a few days, the largest strike till then in human history, since being surpassed by strikes in places like Brazil and India and so on. But until that time, the biggest mass strike in human history that really paralyzes the government of General de Gaulle, really terrifies the ruling class, which begins to raise the possibility of workers' control of society, of a different sort of society. And how and why does all that happen? But I also want to look at how that movement failed. Just a month after these events, one of the ways in which de Gaulle brought the events to a head and reasserted his control was to call an election. And de Gaulle won that election in June 1968, despite these incredible, momentous events. So this is what I want to sort of look at, is both the events themselves, but also try to draw some of the lessons from the events as well. I suppose the thing that I want to get to, though, is that I mean, we can argue about whether what happened in France was a revolution. I wouldn't call it a revolution. It's often just described as a revolution. And at the time it was, there's a revolutionary movement in France and so on. I'm not sure that it went to that stage. There was certainly a potential in the movement for that. But really, I think it is important to see that it had all the elements of what we talk about when we talk about revolutionary politics. Leon Trotsky, writing about the Russian Revolution, put it like this. He said, "The most endurable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historical events. In ordinary times, the state, be it monarchical or democratic, elevates itself above the nation, and history is made by specialists in that line of business, by kings, ministers, bureaucrats, parliamentarians, and journalists. But at those crucial moments when the old order becomes no longer endurable to the masses, they break over the barriers excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives, and create by their own interference the initial groundwork for a new regime. The history of revolution is for us, first of all, a history of the forcible entrance of the masses into the realm of ownership over their own destiny. And that is the spirit and the dynamic that drove events in May in 1968, and as I said, ushered in a period where the working class and lots of other people were able to advance their agenda and go on the offensive. France in 1968 had been ruled by General de Gaulle, who was the leader of the French resistance in the Second World War, and who stepped in as leader in 1958 during a crisis provoked by the French war in Algeria. He had ruled for 10 years, almost exactly to the date of the general strike. He ruled for 10 years, and he ruled as an autocrat, obsessed with quite petty rules, but also wanting to modernize French industry and French society. He presided over a massive expansion of things like the car industry and so on. Citroën, Renault, Peugeot, all those big firms were really built up and so on, but also in aviation technologies and new technologies and so on. And alongside this was a massive growth in the student population. The student population in Paris alone increased from something like 50,000 at the start of the 1960s to 200,000 in 1968. The French government boasted that they were training they were preparing for the technological wave of the future. The government minister in France contrasted with Germany, where the government was training apprentices for the industries of the past. They were training people in universities for the new industries, the new technological industries of the future. In the unions in France, trade unions in France, were incredibly weak. Union membership had declined to very, very low levels, 20-30% most of the time. The bosses of the big car companies like Peugeot and Citroën very often boasted that they hadn't met a union official in 30 years. They just refused to negotiate with the unions, just dismissed them, just did whatever they want. The government had the same attitude. But alongside this was a real simmering discontent over wages and long hours and petty rules. Wages in France are among the lowest in Europe, the second lowest when France joined the European community. And despite the economic boom, despite general growth through the 50s and 1960s, the government was intent on imposing austerity on workers, with massive cuts in social security and increases in taxes in 1967, often met with token strikes called by the unions, but often one hour strikes and those sorts of things, which are quite well supported, but very weak and so on. But this was creating enormous pressures building underneath the surface. It's not completely true that the workers' action in 1968 came out of a blue sky. There had been a series of strikes, and quite significant strikes, throughout 1967 and 1968. There was a bit of an economic downturn, a lot of vulnerable industries that the government was not building up, sort of textile industries and so on, were under real pressure. And in a series of places like Berlier in Lyon, in Rodiacheta, in Besançon, and at Le Mans, striking workers who went on strike were often attacked by the CRS riot police. At the Saviam truck plant in Cannes in January 1968, 400 CRS riot police turned up at the picket line at 4 o'clock in the morning and laid in, attacked the demonstration. 10 of the pickets were very seriously injured. There was resistance to this. 2 days later, the workers from that plant came out and marched through the town and joined by workers from 4 other factories, but again were attacked by the police in the centre of town. So there's an increase in struggle and an underlying sense of resentment and of frustration with the situation that workers are in. But nearly all the strikes that we're talking about end in victory for the employers and lead to demoralisation. And but it is a crucial part of the background to understand that experience. The use of the police as a frontline weapon. I mean, in places like Sweden, Britain, and so on in the 1960s, it wasn't usual to use riot police to break strikes. In France, this was the first port of call for the French authorities, and as opposed to, as I say, André Gortz and Herbert Marcuse, the people who just looked at the surface of society and just talked about workers being apathetic and being bought off and so on, I think a much better understanding of where workers were at in 1968 was that the apparent apathy, as Tony Cliff, the founder of the SWP, put it, that apathy is just anger turned inwards. Unable to find an expression, workers don't feel that they can fight back, or feel that every time they fight back they're beaten and so on. But the anger, and the frustration and the frustration hasn't gone away. And given the opportunity for that to change, workers respond. So the discontent within society, because it had been blocked in terms of workers' action, had to find another channel. And this is where the action by students come in. In some ways, where the demonstrations and the movement began in the Nanterre campus of the University of Paris was a really typical example of the situation that students were in. It was a new build university built to accommodate, sort of the massive expansion of university education. 12,000 students living there with very, very few facilities, run by professors who were very little idea of students' lives. It was surrounded by slums and shanty towns, which housed mainly migrant workers from North Africa, often undocumented workers and so on, who worked in the car industry, the big Renault plants at Flins and Billancourt in Paris, and so on. What began to happen in this situation is that small numbers of students began to protest over issues like Vietnam, but also over things like conditions in the university itself. Very famously, and this is an example of sort of people railing against authority and the imposition of petty rules in France and so on. They demonstrated for the right for men and women to enter each other's dormitories, which wasn't allowed at the university. The right to be treated, the right to be treated as adults. But this was still a very, very small number of people. For example, one of the key events that led up to May 1968 was a small occupation or teaching in Nanterre, just by about 120 students. So that's 120 students out of a student population of 12,000 were involved in this occupation. To give you an example of it, just to describe the occupation and what people were discussing, said the discussions are about the critical university, the anti-imperialist struggle, capitalism today. They look to means to throw light on the repressive structures of the bourgeois state, for situations which will expose them, for a way to act as a detonator. They also pose the question of how student struggles can be connected to workers' struggles, and how to convert the present protest against police repression into a permanent contestation. But this is the sort of thing. This is then met with further repression by the authorities, met by the students planning to have another teach-in, and so on. And in the process of this, a number of the student leaders, I mean, many of the group who came out of this, who called themselves the March 22nd movement, were already political activists from various sort of Maoist sort of backgrounds. Che Guevara had only just been assassinated in late 1967. The influence of Guevara's ideas were very, very important, and the ideas of the Cultural Revolution influenced a lot of people at that time. Anarchists also, some Trotskyist organizations and so on. They were very diffuse, but what united them was an instinctive desire for action for audacity to challenge the authorities and so on. What brought this to the heart of Paris is that Nanterre was just a campus of Paris University. So when the students were disciplined, they were brought to the Sorbonne to appear before a disciplinary committee. 500 students turned up to support them at the start of May. The authorities closed the Sorbonne, fearing the protests. The students were attacked by the police, and over the next week, you had a cycle of every evening students gathering together to demonstrate. Sometimes 20,000 people marching right around Paris in order to gain support, regularly being attacked by the police. This culminates on the Friday night at the end of that week, on the 10th of May, with 50,000 students assembling at the Sorbonne, preparing to march on the Friday evening. The police, thinking that they would stop this demonstration and the riot police, thinking that they'd be able to prevent it, blocked all the bridges across the Seine and kept the students in the Latin Quarter to stop them moving out. What the students did was they turned the tables on the police, and instead of trying to march across the bridges, they instead set up barricades, 60 barricades right around in different parts of the Latin Quarter, and fought the police right throughout the night, and fought them to a standstill in what became known as the Night of the Barricades. It's just to give you a little flavour of what that was like. One of the leaders of the movement, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, I can't find the reference for it. No, here it is. So he said, "It's a moment I shall never forget. Suddenly, spontaneously, barricades were being thrown up in the streets. People were building up the cobblestones because they wanted, many of them, for the first time, to throw themselves into a collective, spontaneous activity. People were releasing all their repressed feelings, expressing them in a festive spirit. Thousands felt the need to communicate with each other, and that night has forever made me optimistic about history. Having lived through it, I can't ever say it will never happen." And that night really sort of was the key moment in these events, because workers who had been, especially young workers, who had been frustrated at the lack of any action about their grievances and their demands, the fear of the police and so on, all of a sudden had that fear lifted, and it was this which really electrified the events. The main union confederations, the CGT, the CFDT, and so on, were meeting that weekend, and in response to the repression of the police on the Friday night, agreed with the student unions to call a general strike on the Monday. And this was enormous. 1 million people marched through Paris on the Monday, and 120 other cities across France demonstrated as well. And you could see from this, all the attempts by the de Gaulle government to condemn the students as demonstrators or as outside agitators and so on, as only these little groups of subversives and so on. So the government called them groupuscules, tiny groups, these little groups of Maoists and Trotskyists and all that sort of stuff. On the big demonstrations in Paris and so on, they carried banners saying, "We are all a groupuscule. 1 million of us. We are all a groupuscule." There was an incredible sense of defiance. In response to this, the government was forced to reopen the Sorbonne, and the students immediately reoccupied it and turned the Sorbonne into pretty much a liberated zone. Pompidou, the Prime Minister, said, "I prefer to give the Sorbonne to the students than see them take it by force, to see them impose another victory after us trying to stop them, the previous week." And what we see from this then, and in the days after, we see an explosion. The Latin Quarter basically became a liberated zone. It's a very funny account in an oral history that was just published this year, about young anarchists who are supposed to, not have any time for any authority and so on, finding themselves having to be traffic wardens in the Latin Quarter because there's no one else to control the traffic, because the police have just disappeared, and the Latin Quarter is in the hands of the students and the people who live there. And it's out of this that we see, young students, going in producing the posters those wonderful slogans that then sort of appeared all over Paris and all over France. Things like sous le pave la plage, under the paving stones is the beach. Sort of demand and be realistic, demand the impossible. All those wonderful sort of situationist slogans that emerged in that struggle. But alongside this, and what becomes really significant about May 1968, because it had just been confined to the students in the centre of Paris in the Latin Quarter, that would have been a big blow to the authority of de Gaulle, but it would not have shaken the regime. What began to happen, and what really gave an immense impetus to events, is that workers went back to their factories the day after the general strike and began talking about what they could do to solve their demands. The students have won in Paris. The students have inflicted a beat. What can we do? What can we do now? In a place, in an aerospace factory, Sud-Aviation in Nantes, in the west of France, young workers agitated the following morning and said we should now occupy the factory and start pressing our demands. And in the space of a couple of days, that idea of occupying factories, taking control of your workplaces, spread like wildfire right across France, and into the big heartlands of French industry, the car factories and so on, the metalworking factories in Normandy in the north of France, the big shipyards in the west of France, and even to school students and their teachers took over their schools and so on. But even in places like the Folies Bergère, or the football players went on strike and occupied the headquarters of the Football Association. Journalists, everybody went on strike. Engineering workers, railway workers, and so on. An enormous and very, very rapid. A very, very rapid spread of this idea of occupying. In Renault-Billancourt in Paris, which is sort of the single largest factory in France at the time, and built in an island in the Seine in Paris, 80,000 or 20,000 workers were on strike and regularly meeting together to discuss what they do, and to see how this interaction between students and workers was happening, and how this was the struggles of the two of the things were sparking off each other. I just want to read an account of an activist from Renault-Billancourt, a car worker, who said, in the first few days of May, every evening I took 5 or 6 workers in my car to the Sorbonne. When they returned to work the next day, they were completely changed people. Through the students in the group of schools, they got their political education, something they didn't get from the Communist Party, which then dominated the trade unions in places like Billancourt. There was a completely libertarian atmosphere at the university, so different from the totalitarian atmosphere at the factory. The student demonstration created an environment in which people were free to coin their own slogans, instead of just the official slogans at trade union demonstrations. When Renault was occupied, the workers experienced a change from control by management using modern manipulative techniques to control by the Communist Party bureaucracy, which is completely totalitarian. In Renault, their freedom was alienated. At the Sorbonne, they felt free. When a worker went to the Sorbonne, he was recognized as a hero. Within Renault, he was only a thing. In this university, he became a man. This atmosphere of freedom, in the sense of being considered human, gave great combativity to the young workers. This was the spirit that was electrifying the movement, propelling the movement forward all over France. The action of young workers, especially in terms of promoting occupations of their workplaces, but then also going out into other local workplaces, encouraging them to take action and so on, was the thing that really began to spread. And what is important about this is what began to be raised within the movement is the whole question of control, not just of individual factories, but the question of who controls towns, who controls the state, who controls society. The workers' action had proved very, very quickly that it's only by workers' action that all of society functions. What they raised within the movement was the possible reordering of society on a completely different basis. That thing that Trotsky was talking about the forcible entry of the masses into controlling their own destinies. In the town of Nantes, where it's the first place where the student movement leapt over into the workers' movement, there are actually incredible experiences of local farmers who, seeing the workplaces going on strike, began to press their own demands, blockading roads with their trucks, bringing lorries and so on to blockade the roads, opening up connections with workers in the cities. Beginning to get cut price, sort of milk and so on, and supplies into the cities. The trade union strike committees began to control the town. The police and so on had absolutely no power over the city for the final week of May. And you can see the outlines of the idea of government control. The government was in a panic and was absolutely paralysed by this. They couldn't even rely on the police. The police in Paris, for example, were deeply resentful of a government that had sent them in to crush the students one week, and then the next week had reopened the university and tried to put all the blame on the police for provoking this. They talked of the government, and their instinctive response was to look to maybe the army and so on. But the French army with 160,000 people with 120,000 conscripts, which was really infected by the spirit of the revolution, of the movement, and very unreliable. It got to such a stage of paralysis that on the 29th of May, the trade unions called another massive demonstration in Paris, 500,000 people, and that day de Gaulle fled the country. It was later, nobody knew where he went. Even his government ministers didn't know where de Gaulle had gone. He had an absolute crisis of confidence. He turned up in a French military base in Baden-Baden in Germany, where he was persuaded, sort of by the general there, General Massu, to take heart and sort of, you need to pull yourself together and get back into it, and so on. But de Gaulle that's an example, I think, of the state of paralysis that the government was in. How does de Gaulle regain control? And this is, I think, one of the key lessons that I want to talk about. He's not able to rely on the traditional methods of repression that he has. The key force that de Gaulle relies on, and that de Gaulle's government relies on, is the Communist Party. The Communist Party in the 1960s in France, in common with most Western European countries, was thoroughly Stalinized. And what that meant is that their politics, their idea of change in society, was thoroughly reformist. For years, the Communist Party had been trying to court respectability, make alliances with moderate socialists like Francois Mitterrand and so on, to be included gradually in a democratic government and occupy cabinet positions. They saw change coming simply through parliamentary change and so on. They believed that that's all that was possible, and they imposed that view, and then they imposed that view on the movement. This was the view of the Communist Party, and therefore this is what the movement must do. And they were completely completely shaken by the idea, and criticised the movement for going beyond those limitations. They saw the movement as, at best, they were very late to come to support the movement. But when they did get involved, at very best, they saw it as a chance to settle outstanding issues like low wages and so on, but not in any way an attempt to reshape society. In fact, the leadership of the Communist Party openly condemned the students for being pseudo-revolutionaries who had nothing to say to the workers, who were just young middle-class students who would go back to work and be bossing in their daddies' factories. And you see, the important point about the Communist Party, though, is that to say that was the key force in the working class. The young revolutionaries who give expression to the movement and the great idealism of the movement, the great hopes of the movement about reshaping society, numbered in total about 400 people in the whole of France in 1968. By contrast, the Communist Party, on that day of the general strike on May the 10th alone, had 20,000 stewards on that demonstration of a million people. 20,000 people that they could call on to follow the orders of the Communist Party, and who had intense loyalty to the Communist Party because of its role in the French resistance and those sorts of things. It's not something that could be just be overcome in a moment. What the Communist Party used that influence and that loyalty to do was to narrow down the demands of the strike. They entered negotiations with the government, came up with an agreement which is very unsatisfactory, but went round from factory to factory trying to get workers to accept that agreement and go back to work, leaving the students isolated and so on. They didn't find that easy. At Renault Billancourt, sort of 15,000 workers in a mass meeting booed them and said, we refuse to accept this. What the Communist Party did very cleverly, I think, was to say, well, okay, you mightn't like this agreement, but we should fight factory by factory for something better. And what this meant was that it left instead of the most militant factories the most militant factories setting the pace, winning agreements that were then spread elsewhere, actually the most militant factories were left to fight alone. An incredible, almost criminal thing happened on the railways, for example. The railways in Paris, all the metro stations were out. The only people who went from station to station were Communist Party union officials. And what they did in order to get people back to work was they went from one station to the other saying, every other station is back, they've all voted to return to work, you're the only one left. And they went to the next station and did the same thing, and so on. This is what they did. And I just want to finish on this. This is actually quite a remarkable thing they did. When doing that, they dragged all the initiative out of the movement. There was a slogan in the Faculty of Medicine in Paris at the time, said, as long as we are strong, the people who are hesitating will follow us, and they will have courage. But the more the movement hesitated, the more the Communist Party held it back, the more that people retreated, the more that people got nervous. And when de Gaulle called the election, and also called on his supporters to take to the streets at the end of May, at the start of June, when 500,000 people marched in support of de Gaulle and so on, the initiative all went his way. The weakest terrain for the Communist Party and for the workers to fight on was in the elections. 30,000 students marched and said the elections are a trap, we shouldn't go into them and so on, but it was nowhere near enough, and de Gaulle ended up winning the election. I've been told to sum up, but I just want to finish on this. The significance of France 1968, as I said at the beginning, is about returning the question of the working class, the potential for the working class to play the role of being the agent of revolution. This is what we have to remember from 1968 and what we have to defend. But there's something else that we have to learn alongside that, is that the traditions and the organizations of reformism within the working class, like the French Communist Party was at that time, will be a barrier to that, and that there needs to be an alternative organization pulling together that revolutionary initiative, charting a way forward for the workers' movement, if that movement is ever going to succeed. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Colm, for that. My name is Babaye. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers League Nigeria, and I temporarily live in France right now. It was quite an interesting one. I enjoyed it. But for what I just want to say is the question of France in '68 was within a broader context of, the fire last time, so to speak, as Chris Aman's book put it. And you see, while we are now to look at what lessons could be learned from then and now, because while we are witnessing the longest depression after the Great Depression, 1968 was, you could say, it was the in their face response of working class people to the supposed capitalism having gotten itself into a lasting groove, the issue of students, like Trotsky said, of youth being the barometer of the revolution. It's like in my country, for example, in Nigeria. One of the things in the late 80s into to the early 90s, you see that closeness of demonstrations of students, strikes. Truth is concrete, yes, and this might be some generalization, but it's also that you had more children from working class backgrounds getting into universities. All these things, I think these were things that before the war, you had only largely the children of the elites going. So you had you had multiple sites of radicalization of youths, and at the same time, the question also of, you had something similar in a number of countries, but why was it mainly in France? And you had the working class moving, you had the youth moving, Berkeley and what have you in the US, the civil rights movement. You had in the UK, I mean, the mass movements too, and I think one of the main reasons, I think it was in Ian Beecher's book about how the IS made gains in this, in that you had someone like Tony Cliff being regularly in the LSE cafes, debating, discussing, with student activists. Why was it that it was mainly in France that you had that explicit, at least for a fleeting moment, unity between the studentry and the working class movement? And I think that also shows years of work of the left within the working class movement. It shows some traditions, not exactly a response to the issue of 1871 Paris Commune and all that, but that elements of the history of left in it. But it also showed the way the trade unions, particularly the CGT, you could say, betrayed how this unity. It also showed the limitations, of Stalin's politics as supposedly socialist politics. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, come in back.
I wanted to just go back to a phrase that Colm used earlier on, right at the beginning, talking about the events in Paris, France being the epicentre of events, I think, in time and space was the phrase that you used. And I mean, there are meetings, which could be held, and maybe they have been held at Marxism in the past, about the implications of this. I mean, I was, in fact, 16 at the time when these events started to unfold. And, I remember myself being, a school student in the Midlands, reading. I spent my Christmas of '68 reading a book which, it wasn't written by Chris Harman. It was written by two Guardian Observer journalists called French Revolution 1968. It was a Penguin special, and I spent the weekend, reading about the events that were going on. And for me, they were inspiring. For lots of other people of my generation, they were similarly inspiring. And we drew inspiration, which helped us to organise in the school where I was at, in all sorts of campaigns that went on for years afterwards. And it's very important, I think, to recognise that everybody draws conclusions from the events like what happened in 1968. For some, it was a process of radicalisation and moving towards a recognition of the importance of the working class, and a cynicism, as the book that I was referring to had, about the role of the Communist Party in France, which was a lesson that I was able to sort of carry on through a lot of other political activities in the years subsequent to that. But the other sort of conclusions that were around in the 1960s, which I don't know if it's worth going analysing at all, but the idea of that in the SWP we recognise that the working class is a central agent of social change. For a lot of people, the fact that that the students were the instigators, it seemed, of what was going on in Paris doesn't actually mean that they are the agents of social change. Just as it was in Vietnam, the role of the peasants taking on the might of the American imperialism doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be the people that will create revolutionary change within the rest of the world. And it's very important, that when we think about conclusions that people draw, that they are not always the ones that we would like them to have, and sometimes they can create pockets or movements which actually can be quite diverse and diversive in terms of how we actually achieve social change in the future.
Anybody else? We've got plenty of time. Yeah?
Yeah, I'd just like to add as well that obviously by the time what we saw during that period is that the whole period of creativity and culture. There was I think the opera house and stuff was taken over for massive debates, and that's the kind of thing that happens when obviously it's more powerful. It can happen more powerfully in an extended period of struggle like that. But we do see examples of it time and time again. Actually, every time. It always surprises me, when there's a strike, like the junior doctors or something like that, the creativity that can spring out of it straight away. And I think that's important that we say that potential is always there among workers, and we, as revolutionaries, that's what we always look to. But, and I remember I grew up in rural Gloucestershire, where there was one Morning Star, Daily Worker reader, and it was regarded as being very odd. But I remember at the time, literally I don't believe there were any Labour Party members in the place I grew up in. But I remember seeing on the TV at the time around that whole period as well, the pictures from the counter in Woolworths, the black and white students together getting ketchup water. I mean, of course, watching that on the main news, that changed people all over the world. I'm sure it did. But one thing I want to draw the link of as well, particularly because it's such a contentious issue today, is about the link between 68 and also the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, if you could touch on that a bit, because that's quite important as well, because that's an unresolved struggle here. And I know, for example, somebody said recently that they claimed that how they stopped the Sinn Féin carrying political banners on these protests, but I don't believe that they were even around in that time. So if you could make a connection and perhaps what the links were and what the inspiration was for the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland.
Anybody else who hasn't spoken yet? If not, yeah, you can.
Okay. There's something that because of the time, I've forgotten. Is that 1964, which is also just before that, is the opening up of the church with the encyclic. I think it's maybe someone else knows. Rerum Novarum, I think it is. Yeah, where the church is opening up and is getting rid of a whole lot of things that were holding back the people of freedom, and from there the sexual revolution exploded. But as the comrade from Nigeria points out, France was indeed the only country in the G8 in Europe, that had an impetus from the Marshall Plan, from after the war. That was not a Nazi country, because Italy had been fascist, you had Spain that had been fascist, and you had Germany that had been fascist, and there was it's only the hope of France, the hope of a generation that had fought against Nazism, that could build up this pressure for a revolutionary movement.
Anybody else? I mean, what we can do if people are up for it, Colm, you can come back for a bit, and then because we've got loads of time, and then if there's any more questions or anything else people want to say after that, if Colm comes back on the discussion so far, and then maybe we can continue afterwards if people want to. Can we do that?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that if that's okay with people. Yeah, okay. Some really very interesting questions and contributions there. I mean, just going back to the start, the question of the commune and so on. It is true that people, not primarily, but they did mention it. On the student demonstrations right throughout May, students demonstrated right across Paris, and it would be very common for people to say, "Let's go to the Bastille." Bastille is no longer there, but to raise that, so that notion from 1789, or go to the Hotel de Ville, which was the centre and sort of the commune in 1871, and so on, and go down there. Unfortunately, when you read accounts of it, sort of that they talked about that, and they talked about sort of having that instinctive memory, that historical memory in France of the building of barricades, of that they were engaged in something that had echoes throughout French history. But too often when you read accounts of it, sort of what they tended to do, and what sort of some of the participants who were involved in the movement sort of found themselves frustrated at, is that these demonstrations would go out and they'd be involved in a lot of action committees, but each evening they would draw back into the Latin Quarter, the police would attack them again, there'd be a ritual riot and so on, and that there was a frustration in this, that they weren't sort of making those making those connections. But I think the other thing, the influence of the Commune, is that the Communist Party, not alone sort of having all sort of the loyalty and the reasons for loyalties that I was talking about, very understandable and admirable and honourable reasons for that. Sort of people were still living in France who had seen people killed for being members of the Communist Party during the occupation and during the Second World War and all that sort of stuff. This is not to be sniffed at, but the Communist Party were the ones who said, we're the inheritors of the tradition of the Commune. We are the ones who inherit that tradition. But what communism means now is gradual change, is reform. Let's not be too radical. Let's not, there's not the space, the time is not right to do anything about fundamentally changing society. What we've got to do is gradually build up our forces within society, achieve some credibility, and have a democratic government, and that's the stage two. So that's a very interesting question. Sort of how that whole historical memory and that understanding of history then is expressed through political organisations, which then have their own view of it, and I think quite a narrow view of it. But it's you're absolutely right. So that the democracy of the commune, sort of that first example of sort of workers' organisation is a tremendous example to look to. But unfortunately, at the hands of the Communist Party, that's narrowed down to a very to a very reformist idea. I want to say something about why only in France. This is an interesting question. See, I tried to describe the sort of particular conditions in France, and there was I think the absence of a significant. The Communist Party, sort of in a lot of ways, was marginalised and ignored. It comes to play a very important and crucial role for the regime, even despite its small size and the fact that it had been ignored for so long. But in other countries where there was the potential, sort of big Labour Party here in Britain and so on, potential for other organisations to play that role. The British government, for example, as I said, sort of really didn't rely on police repression and so on to break strikes. It relied much more and increasingly throughout the 1970s, and this is a pattern repeated right throughout Europe. The ruling class relied on a layer within the trade unions, the trade union bureaucracy, the Labour Party, and so on, to act responsibly in the interests of the nation, understand economic realities, and so on, and have a pacifying influence on the working class movement. And that time and again, that's the sort of thing that happened. And you see, not understanding that meant that. I mean, this is what's very interesting about the student movement and the student radicalism that we were talking about. You see, there were groups in Britain. 1968 is the time of the massive Vietnam War demonstrations led by Tariq Ali and all that sort of stuff. Sort of tens and tens of thousands of people demonstrating on them. Beginning of student occupations at the LSE and that sort of thing. But the ideas that influenced those students were very much based on the idea, I think, fundamentally, as I tried, I started off with it, a fundamental pessimism about the possibility of the working class being the agent of social revolution. But and I think unfortunately, quite a superficial view. And what tended to happen, but they could give expression to the hopes of the movement that was emerging. Sort of Tariq Ali's newspaper, the Red Dwarf. or the Black Dwarf, sorry. Black Dwarf had a wonderful headline. I often think it's just a wonderful image, you know, sort of, and the headline was, "We will fight, we will win, London, Paris, Rome, Berlin." Do you know what I mean? Like, we're all involved in the united struggle, and, you know, we're really going to take on the authorities everywhere. That was the spirit. It was brilliant that, you know, sort of people like that articulated it. But when you didn't see that mass working class action, as in France, you could also see how that very quickly became translated or encouraged ideas of student power, I mean, it was quite remarkable, some of the people sort of around Tariq Ali and those sort of people involved in very prominent roles in the movement in Britain, who translated the ideas of Che Guevara, right? And remember, Guevara's ideas, for all he was a tremendous hero, and for all he was a massive thorn in the side to American imperialism and all that sort of great symbol of resistance to American imperialism, Guevara's theory was that, and strategy was, that we will take over and liberate particular areas and then gradually build on them and so on. We'll build, you know, sort of red bases, you know, sort of peasant bases and so on, and gradually encircle the bourgeoisie in the cities. That was his strategy. Students involved in the movement in Britain, for example, and elsewhere, translated this into saying the students will create red bases. They'll be the equivalent of the peasants in the Third World, and they will create red bases in the universities, will be liberated zones, and then this will gradually spread out to the rest of society and show people how to be liberated and live in a liberated way. Now, you see, you can see why that sort of catches fire, especially when people are involved in a movement in which, you know, it seems the students are really racing ahead and the workers are all apathetic. They're all sitting at home watching their TV and that sort of thing. I'm sure we're familiar with different formulations of that sort of view and so on. But what it leads to, I think, is intense demoralisation. At best, it leads to that. Unfortunately, right across Europe as well, in the period after that, that frustration of not being able to break through using student power, because students have very, very little power in society, misunderstanding that the thing that really put the fear into the French ruling class was workers' action. That's why they moved might and main to get the workers back to work. That's the thing that really frightened them. And believe in something called student power leads to disillusionment, or it leads to, especially in situations of police repression, of people saying that we now have to need to take up arms. You know, the Red Brigades in Italy, the Baader-Meinhof gang, and so on in Germany, and so on, are an expression of that I think mistaken politics that just expresses the frustration with the existing society, which doesn't look to the way in which society works and the way in which class struggle can change it. And I think that's why it's, you know, very important to try and draw out. This is why I would recommend to everybody this book by Chris Harman, 1968, The Fire Last Time. It's an absolutely magnificent survey of not just 1968 itself, but also sort of what developed from 1968. And I think the brilliant thing about what Harman does is that he really takes seriously those revolutionary groups. I mean, I don't mean in any way to be dismissive, you know, sort of the people that I'm talking about. I think lots of them played really heroic, brilliant roles in that movement. Harman takes those people very, very seriously. In some ways, they look like very small groups on the margins of society, the groups of Trotskyists and Maoists and so on that existed and were involved in these movements. What Harman saw in them is the beginnings of people trying to find a way through the terribly deep frozen politics of Stalinism. Remember, back in the 50s, 60s, right into the 80s and 90s and so on, the Cold War and that monolithic block of Stalinism and the weight that had on the workers' movement and on the associated the ideas of socialism or revolution and so on, deeply, deeply affected it. These were people who were trying to find an alternative. That's why they looked at Guevara. That's why they had illusions in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That's why they looked for some way through it. And in these events, and this is what Harman takes very seriously, is they attempted to put that into practice. The French students who were influenced by these ideas really did go out and lead demonstrations from the Sorbonne of 10,000 students down to the Renault plant in Billancourt to say, we support your action. This is a wonderful thing to do. They were really trying to make that attempt. Very unfortunately, the Communist Party sent out the shop stewards to block the gates and refused to allow them in. This is the great tragedy of it. But those students were actually attempting to do it. But trying to understand that connection between theory and practice is very, very important. This is why I think stands to the International Socialists, who are the forerunners of the Socialist Workers Party. Because well, being involved in the movements and being at the heart of the Vietnam War movements and so on, being at the heart of occupations in the LSE and so on, they never lost sight of the idea that the working class is the revolutionary class in society. And if you talk to anybody or you read any of the comrades who were around at that time, who joined as young students, the thing that stood out about the International Socialists, people like Chris Harman and so on, who were around at that time and played a very, very important role in events, what they argued was, we need to get down and speak to the workers who are on strike when they're building the Barbican at that time and so on. They're on picket lines. We need to go down to them, sell them a revolution, try and sell them a revolutionary newspaper, try to put in a leaflet about how they can win the strike, how they can spread solidarity and so on. Because unless we build a base in the working class, unless we build an organisation of socialist workers that coordinate their struggles, that present an alternative to the reformist leadership in the working class, then we'll never get anywhere. And in that way, kept their feet on the ground. And the final thing I'll say then is the question then is civil rights in Northern Ireland, because I could go on forever about the question of civil rights in Northern Ireland. I think that the young radicals who led the movement in the north in 1968 were deeply, people like Eamon McCann and Bernadette Devlin were deeply influenced by what they saw in France. Also in Czechoslovakia, also in the civil rights movement in America in 1968. They sang over and over again on their demonstrations, they sang "We Shall Overcome," which is one of the songs of the American civil rights movement. They really saw themselves intimately connected. There's a fantastic story about the young radicals in Derry, Dermot McClenaghan, Eamon McCann and so on, when a young student, Jan Palach, was killed during the events in Prague, in Czechoslovakia. They went down to the post office in Derry and wrote a telegram to Jan Palach and to the students of Prague. They just addressed it to the general post office in Prague, and they didn't know where else to send it. They said, "The people of Derry are with you." Do you know what I mean? This is the sort of sense of international connection that were going on, the inspiration that people were taking were taken from events, and certainly the idea of responding to police repression. And this again, the north of Ireland was different to Britain again. It was very similar to France. The first line of defence was to send the police in and crack a few heads if people were getting out of line and so on. But the resistance to that was certainly inspired by what people had seen in France. Unfortunately, the dominant views in the movement that emerged in the civil rights movement were that Martin Luther King peaceful movement. We just need to be peaceful. We need to just embarrass the authorities by being so peaceful and getting them to show themselves up. That that something will change. Someone will step in. The British government will step in to change everything, and everything will be all right. But at the same time, versions of those ideas with much deeper roots in Irish society and Irish republicanism and so on, the ideas that I was talking about, then emerge in response to the police repression, and you get the emergence of a new and reinvigorated Republican movement that says that all that peaceful protesting is getting us nowhere. We need to take up arms and fight and so on. And unfortunately, the people who had some ideas of mass action, mass demonstrations and so on, lost out and were squeezed out in the process of that, in the process of those two ideas coming to dominate the movement. I'm sorry.
It's all right. We've got a little bit more time, just if anyone wants to ask anything else, or yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say that it's important that people read Chris Harman's book, and I think it's important to take on board the subtitle, which is 1968 and after. And I think in terms of the workers' militancy in France, that was the most explosive example in the period, but it was by no means the only one. And I think what characterised the period 68 and afterwards was class struggle, not just student radicalism, because in France it went much further. But in places like Italy, they had the hot autumn the following year, when there was a mass revolt of workers in the the factories to the north. People had come up from the south to get jobs and were revolting against the way they'd been treated. In Britain we had a period of a huge upsurge of industrial struggle in the early 70s, which toppled the Tory government. And also in Spain and Portugal, there was those big workers' movements which forced the overthrew fascism in France and in Spain. But in Portugal, there was an actual revolution triggered by the army, but again led to workers taking over the factories and threatening a revolution there. So I don't think we should look at France as the exception. It was the kind of the trigger of it all, the place where it went furthest, but it was not unique. And I think that's to do with what a comrade said earlier, that this was the end of the post-war boom, the beginning of the crisis that we've been in pretty well ever since. But also it's the fact that despite the sort of lazy kind of academics saying that workers have been bought off, in fact people have not benefited that greatly from the boom. Things weren't as great as people were being told, and there was an enormous amount of discontent which the kind of Marcuses and co did not see, because they looked at the service, and these explosive events really showed that the amount of discontent that was under there. And I think I think the role of the trade union bureaucracy is important, including in France, because the Communist Party did control the CGT, the main trade union federation, and they behaved just like trade union bureaucrats behaved anywhere else. They may have superficially been more radical because they're in the Communist Party, that behaved exactly the same way as the trade union bureaucrats in Britain and elsewhere in dampening down the struggle. And I think that obviously the key lesson of this, as in so many other historical events, is we need to build revolutionary organisations now in relatively normal times, because when things kick off, that is crucial to things going further, and us not being, and the Communist Party bureaucrats not being going to go around to the metro saying, the lot down the road have gone back to work, because we know we'll have a network, we know that's not true, we have the links and the organisation to take it much further and not allow the bureaucrats, etc., to strangle the movement.
To wrap up now, I think Colm just wanted a couple more minutes just to finish something up. Before he does that, it's already been mentioned, but there is a bookshop downstairs, Bookmarks, which has, amongst other things, if you want to read more about 68, we have Chris Harman's book, 1968, The Fire Last Time, which has already been mentioned, but is very, very good, and people who are interested in finding out more about what happened in 68 should definitely read it. And then we also have May Made Me by Mitchell Abide. I apologise to people in France, I can't pronounce that. But that's also available in Bookmarks. And so, along with loads of other stuff, so go down there, have a look. Book Colm, do you want to?
Yeah, I can really recommend both books. I really enjoyed reading that. I think the conclusions of it, unfortunately, are really strange for somebody who's an anarchist. He ends up agreeing with the Communist Party shop stewards that he goes around and talks to. But some of the stories that you find in that book are just absolutely incredible. People talking about young women especially. And I don't know if you noticed in the film, there was a meeting in one of the mass meetings of the during the events, where they were almost continual sessions and so on. There's a meeting of the radical left with 7 or 8 people, including Daniel Colm Bryce and so on, lined up on the platform to speak, and all of them are men. Do you know what I mean? It was a testament to the patriarchal nature of French society, but it really was a frustration for for the women who were involved in their thousands in that movement. But some great accounts in that oral history. A young woman who says that she went home one time, and she made herself a mini skirt, and she put around the hem of it. She said the indecency is not in the hemline of my garments, in your gaze. And it was a wonderful, sort of sense of liberation, and women talking about how they, for the first time, knew they had to get up in mass assemblies and make an argument for the action that they needed, and in doing that, they found their voice and so on, and they were activists for the rest of their lives and all that sort of stuff, and all that flowed into the women's movement in France and all that sort of stuff. The one thing I wanted to say was, and I forgot to come back to it because it was asked earlier about the movement in France today, because this is a very curious thing. It's something I meant to mention in the main talk. You see, the Macron government talked late last year about commemorating May 68. May 68 still has an enormous influence in French society. It's still a key touchstone for French politics. I think it's a nightmare that haunts the French ruling class and so on. For years and years, no politician would criticise what happened in May 1968. It was Nicolas Sarkozy who, as a 13-year-old, joined the big de Gaulle demonstration on the 1st of June, because he was already a right-winger at that time, who came out and condemned 1968 for being the cause of all the ills of French society and so on, all the individualism and all that sort of stuff. All the, he said, good manners and respect were out of fashion, nothing was sacred, nothing was admirable, and there were no rules and no standards, and nothing was forbidden. He just absolutely condemned it. But Macron, trying to balance between left and right, he says he's beyond left and right now. He's sort of, this new breed of politician, was going to commemorate May 1968. And then, in implementing his attacks on the working class, he provoked a massive sort of movement of students and workers in France, students right across the country, blockading and having sit-ins, refusing to take exams and all that sort of stuff, alongside railway workers, airline workers and so on, taking action in order to preserve their rights. And I think what's really interesting about that is that I was just reading a Financial Times article which said that Macron is actually the inheritor of 1968. He's the forward-looking one, and these students who are trying to preserve access to university education, because Macron wants to implement exams to go on to university, and the workers who are trying to protect their rights and so on, are the ones who are reactionary now. They're conservative, they're backward-looking and so on. Macron is trying to take France into this brave new world. A quite remarkable piece. But that is the sort of thing how France, how May 1968 is still contested. And you see people like Marine Le Pen as well, which I think it's important for us to see. Marine Le Pen takes Sarkozy's hatred of May 1968 to new levels. The fascist far right, who sort of said it's led to communitarianism at the expense of the nation. We have to have a very different view, and I think fight to defend a different memory of 1968. And I want to finish with this: is that by the time, this is from John Molyneux, who's been a long-term member of. He joined the International Socialists in 1968. And who had been in France in May 1968, had been, sort of in the Latin Quarter and all that sort of stuff, and returned completely inspired. And he said, when he returned to Southampton, he says, I was convinced of three things: that revolution was possible, that the agent of revolution was the working class, and that it was necessary to build a revolutionary organisation in the working class to challenge the leadership of the reformist trade union officials and the old communist parties, whom I saw opposing and selling out the May struggle by working to end the strike as soon as possible. And sometime in June, Tony Cliff, the founder of the SWP, visited Southampton to give a talk to about 4 or 5 students. I think that's worth all remembering. Sometimes when we're in small meetings, so we gave a talk to 4 or 5 students. This is in the middle of 1968, to argue more or less exactly this. And I joined the International Socialists, because this is what our politics has been based on since. The idea that we need to build a socialist movement, a radical revolutionary socialist movement and organisation within the working class in order to challenge those reformist ideas that puts workers at the heart of the struggle for socialism. And I'll just finish with this: the president of Nanterre University this year did commemorate 1968, and they apparently commissioned wall paintings and sort of graffiti art and all that sort of stuff to commemorate 1968. A couple of days later, because the students had gone into occupation and blockaded the university, blockaded the exams, he called in the riot police to get the students out of Nanterre University. Just just an incredible sense of irony. But a piece of graffiti appeared in Paris in the weeks just following that, and the student graffiti in Paris said, May 1968, they're commemorating, we're starting again. And I think that's what we need to be looking at, and see the potential in all of those struggles today, and marry that with serious socialist politics that can chart a way forward for those struggles to win.